Let's understand the various types of economic planning, a very important topic to understand. Now, when we are discussing types of economic planning, we can classify it into various ways. It could be centralized, decentralized, structural, functional. So, here are the lists that we would be discussing today. The very important type of planning we understand is indicative planning, or planning by what we call as inducements, in contrast to a directive planning or planning by direction. A directive planning, we can say, is similar to a military rule. Do these things, and that's set by the government, and that has to be followed. As simple as that, and we call this as planning by direction. So it governs how much would be the foreign exchange, how much would be the price allocation, how much would be the resource allocation, and everything is well directed, similar to we could say a military rule. The next is indicative planning. Indicative planning helps us understand how we would boost production. So when we are talking about involvement, it would help us encourage saving, bring in more investments, and have a more purposeful, well-defined way of direction, because it is governed by incentives. Very important thing, it is governed by incentives, and when there are incentives, definitely it would have more better results. The next is physical versus financial planning. Now, physical planning talks about physical allocation of resources. How much resource should be allocated to which sector? So, there is physical allocation. Financial planning talks about in order to establish a good demand and supply between the market, what should be the ways through which the planning should be done to bring economic stability, and therefore we call it as financial planning. The next is centralized planning versus decentralized planning. So under centralized planning, all the decision comes from the central government, one single authority which defines or decides all the important aspects is called as a centralized planning. Decentralized planning is divided between the state, the center, the counties, or the different regions in which the country is broken. So those are another ways of defining it. The next is structural and functional, indicative and imperative. Very similar to what we have discussed. Now, structural talks about the socio-economic structure of a region. However, functional talks about bringing a change in that structure. So functional talks about function, that means bringing a change in the existing structure. Structural talks about the basic layout, the trade, the transport, the basic infrastructure abilities. Indicative, as I said, is based on planning which is governed by incentives. So this indicative planning could be based on forecasting, it would be based on policy approach or a corporate approach, right? However, imperative planning, on the other hand, is directive planning. It is well defined how you have to do certain thing in a defined format. The next is democratic or totalitarian planning. Democratic is where the philosophy of democracy, as the name suggests, is applied. That means whenever the plan is prepared, the views of the common people are taken into account. Totalitarian, as the name suggests, is a total rule. That means there is a central control indicating that this is how the plan must be implemented and it should be done in the same way. The next is fixed versus rolling plan. Fixed plan is a relation for a given time period. So it is time bound, it is well defined. Rolling, on the other hand, is continuous. So usually the plan intervals could be 1 year, 2 years, but it is a rolling process. One after the other, you keep on going with that plan. The next is short term, medium term and long term planning. Now, what is the difference? Short term planning is usually less than 1 year. Medium term is 3 to 7 years. 10 to 30 years is a long term planning. The next is corrective versus developmental planning. So corrective planning talks about removing any kinds of errors in the planning. It defines that this should be the expenditure and this is the present expenditure. So how do you actually oversee that, and how do you correct it? How do you rectify it? Developmental planning, on the other hand, is planning on a whole. that these are the things or the improvement areas that need to be done and how we can move forward with these things. The next is capitalist versus socialist. So capitalist is a free enterprise economy. There is no authority of the governing planning activity, and it is freely in the hand of private players. However, socialist planning is a planning which is suggested by the government and therefore takes into account all the segments of the society. A combination of this capitalist and socialist planning, we could say, is a mixed planning, which is seen as a perfect example in India. So those are some of the important ways under which economic planning can take place. All of them have their drawbacks and the benefits on the sideline. So we need to be very cautious about what kind of approach we take into account. Each of them have their merits and demerits associated with them. Thanks for joining in. We have covered extensive economics lectures on our other portal, the links for which are available below. Thanks for joining.